She had exactly $3.42 to her name, a little girl waiting at home who hadn't eaten since breakfast, and a decision to make in less than 10 seconds. The young man ahead of her at the checkout counter was being turned away, his card declined, the line behind him growing restless. Nobody there knew who he was. Grace Miller certainly didn't. All she saw was a person in trouble, and what she chose to do in that moment, with the last few dollars in her pocket, would set in motion a story that people in that city would tell for years. Grace Miller was 31 years old, and by the world's usual way of measuring things, she did not have much. She rented 2 small rooms at the back of an old building on the east side of the city, where the radiators knocked in the winter, and the window let in a thin whistle of cold air, no matter how many towels she pressed against the sill. She worked the closing shift as a custodian at Hartwell Market, a mid-sized grocery store on the corner of 9th and Vine, mopping the aisles long after the last customer had gone home, wiping down the freezer cases, and hauling the trash to the alley under a sky that had already turned to stars. It was honest work, it was hard work, and it was the only thing standing between her and the fear that lived quietly in the back of her mind, the fear that she might not be able to give her daughter the life she deserved. That daughter was named Lily. She was 6 years old, with a gap in her front teeth and a laugh that could fill a whole room, and she was, without question, the finest thing Grace had ever done in her life. Lily's father had left before she was old enough to remember him, and Grace had long since stopped waiting for him to come back, or to send anything at all. She did not waste her days on bitterness. She simply got up every morning, made breakfast out of whatever was in the cupboard, walked Lily to the neighbor's apartment, where an older woman named Mrs. Alvarez watched her during the evening shift, and went to work. That was the shape of her life. Small, steady, and held together by love and effort in almost equal measure. People who knew Grace would tell you she was the kindest person they had ever met, and they would say it without exaggeration. She was the one who remembered the names of the other custodians' children. She was the one who left a little extra in the tip jar at the corner diner, even when she could barely spare it. She was the one who, when a stranger dropped a bag of oranges in the parking lot, chased 2 of them down the sidewalk and returned them with a smile. She did these things not because anyone was watching, and not because she expected anything back. She did them because that was simply who she was. Her mother, long since passed, had raised her on a single idea, repeated so often, it had worn a groove into her heart, that every person you meet is carrying something heavy, and the least you can do is not add to the weight. On the evening our story truly begins, Grace was between tasks, pushing her mop bucket toward the front of the store, when she noticed a small commotion at the checkout counter. A young man stood there, perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a plain gray jacket and a pair of work boots that had seen better days. He did not look like a man of means. He looked, in fact, like anyone, like a delivery driver on his break or a fellow just off a long shift. In his hands he held a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small bag of apples. And in front of him, the cashier, a young woman named Dana, was shaking her head. "Sir, if you can't pay, I'm going to need you to step aside," Dana said, not unkindly, but with the tired firmness of someone at the end of a long day. "There are other customers waiting." The young man patted his jacket, then his back pocket, then his jacket again. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I have it here somewhere. I must have left my wallet in the truck. Just give me 1 minute. I'll run out and get it." "I've already given you 3 minutes," Dana said. "If you don't have a way to pay, I need you to hand those back so I can help the next person." Behind him, the line stirred. A man in a business suit checked his watch and sighed loudly. A woman muttered something to her companion about people who came to the store without money. The young man's ears went red, and he set the loaf of bread down on the belt very carefully, as though he did not want to make a scene, as though he were used to the particular kind of quiet that falls over a crowd when they have decided a person is not worth their patience. Grace watched all of this from a few feet away, her hands still on the mop handle, and something in her simply would not allow it to continue. She had stood in that man's shoes more times than she cared to count. She knew exactly what it felt like to be short at the register while strangers stared, to do the frantic math in your head, to weigh which item you could put back and still call it dinner. She knew the particular loneliness of that moment. So she let go of the mop, stepped forward, and asked the question that would change everything. "Excuse me," she said to the cashier. "How much is all of it?" Dana blinked at her. "The bread, the eggs, the apples. It comes to $9.40. Grace reached into the front pocket of her apron. She pulled out a small folded stack of bills and some coins, and she counted them out on the counter without hesitation. 3 ones, a few quarters, a dime and 2 pennies, $3.42. It was not enough for all of it. It was, in fact, everything she had. "Give him the bread," she said quietly. "And the eggs, if this covers it. Keep the rest." The young man turned to her, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. A good face, honest, with dark eyes that were now wide with surprise. "Ma'am," he said, "you don't have to do that. Please, you don't even know me." "No, I don't," Grace agreed. "But I know you're hungry, and I know that nobody should have to feel ashamed for forgetting their wallet." She slid the bread toward him. "Take it, it's all right." For a long moment he didn't move. He just looked at her, at the plain apron and the tired eyes, and the small pile of coins that she had pushed across the counter without a second thought. Then, very softly, he asked, "What's your name?" "Grace," she said. "Grace Miller." He nodded slowly, and something passed across his face that she could not quite read. "Grace," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I won't forget this." She only smiled, picked her mop back up, and went about the rest of her evening, the way you do after a small thing, never dreaming it was anything more than that. She finished her shift, she walked home under the stars, she kissed her sleeping daughter's forehead, and she went to bed with an empty wallet and a full heart, having no idea at all that she had just given the last of her money to one of the wealthiest young men in the entire country. Because the man in the gray jacket and the worn boots was named Ethan Caldwell, and Ethan Caldwell was the chief executive of Caldwell Holdings, a company his late father had built from a single hardware store into one of the largest development firms in America. He had a habit, one that drove his advisors half to distraction, of dressing plainly and slipping out into the world to see it as an ordinary person saw it. He believed that you could not truly build for people you did not understand, and that you could not understand them from behind a desk on the 40th floor. So he walked the neighborhoods himself, he rode the buses, he shopped in the grocery stores, and on that particular evening, in a moment of genuine forgetfulness, he had left his wallet in the console of the plain pickup truck he drove, precisely so that no one would look at him twice. He had expected, when he was turned away, to simply walk out to the truck, retrieve his wallet, and come back. He had not expected the size of the crowd, or the coldness of it, or how quickly a room full of strangers could decide that a man was worth nothing at all. And he certainly had not expected the tired woman in the apron who set down her mop and gave him the last $3 she had in the world. That night, Ethan Caldwell sat in his study for a long time, turning the loaf of bread over in his hands, thinking about a woman named Grace who had looked at a stranger and seen only a person worth helping. The next morning, Grace arrived for her shift to find the store manager, a man named Robert Hale, waiting for her by the time clock, with a folder in his hand and an expression she did not like. "Grace," he said, "come to my office, please." She followed him back, her stomach already tightening. Robert was not a cruel man exactly, but he was a nervous one, always looking over his shoulder at the regional office, always more worried about the rules than about the people the rules were supposed to serve. He sat down behind his desk, folded his hands, and did not quite meet her eyes. "Do you know why I called you in?" he asked. "No," she said, though a small cold feeling told her she might. "Yesterday, at the front register," he tapped the folder, "you inserted yourself into a customer transaction. You overrode a decision the cashier had already made. You used your position as an employee to interfere in a situation that was, frankly, none of your business." Grace stared at him. "Robert, that man was being turned away in front of a whole line of people because he forgot his wallet. I bought him a loaf of bread with my own money, that's all." "That's not the point," Robert said, still not looking at her. "Company policy is very clear. Employees do not interfere in cashier operations. Employees do not create scenes on the sales floor. There's a way we do things here, and there's a chain of command, and yesterday you stepped outside of it." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. "This is a notice of suspension, effective immediately. It's out of my hands." For a moment, Grace could not speak. She looked at the paper, at the words printed there, and she felt the floor of her small, careful life tilt beneath her. "Robert," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not, "I bought a hungry man a loaf of bread. That's what I did. If that's against the rules, then I don't understand the rules." "I know," Robert said, and for the first time he looked genuinely pained. "I do know, Grace, and for what it's worth, I think you're one of the best workers I've got. But the policy is the policy, and if I let it go, it comes back on me." He shook his head. "You can pick up your final pay on Friday." Grace thought about Lily, about the rent that was due at the end of the month, about the small stack of coins she had pushed across the counter the night before. She thought about the fear that lived in the back of her mind, and how it had just walked out of the shadows and sat down across from her wearing Robert Hale's tired face. She wanted to argue. She wanted to plead. But she had never in her life begged for anything, and something in her would not let her start now. So she picked up the notice, folded it once, and stood. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me yourself." And she walked out of that office, and out of that store, and into a morning that had suddenly become the most frightening morning of her life, having lost her job for the crime of being kind. She did not know, of course, that at that very hour, across the city and 40 floors up, Ethan Caldwell was standing at the window of his office, describing that same tired woman in the apron to his mother. Eleanor Caldwell was 74 years old and had been the chairman of the board of Caldwell Holdings since her husband's passing. She was a formidable woman, sharp as a tack, with white hair pinned up and a gaze that missed nothing. She had raised her son to be many things, but above all, she had raised him to remember that the family's fortune was not the point of the family, only its tool. She listened to his story now with her hands folded in her lap and her head tilted slightly, the way she always listened when something mattered. "She had $3, Mother," Ethan said, "maybe less, and she gave it to a stranger without a second thought. When I asked her why, she said, 'I know you're hungry.' That was all. She didn't want thanks. She didn't want anything. She picked up her mop and went back to work." He shook his head slowly. "Do you understand what that means? A person who gives away the last of what they have. That's not someone who has plenty to spare. That's someone who is doing without and helping anyway." "What's her name?" Eleanor asked. "Grace," he said. "Grace Miller. She works at the Hartwell Market on 9th. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what your father would have said. He'd have said money can hire 100 talented people, but it can't hire even one person like that. You either have that in you or you don't." She looked at her son. "So what are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to find her," Ethan said, "and I'm not going to write a check and be done with it. A check is easy. A check is what people do when they want to feel good and get on with their day. This is something else." He turned from the window. "Marcus," he called to his assistant, who was waiting near the door. "Find out everything you can about a woman named Grace Miller, who works at the Hartwell Market, and have the car ready for the morning. I'm going to the east side." It took Marcus less than a day to learn what there was to learn, and part of what he learned was this, that Grace Miller had been suspended from her job the very morning after the incident for interfering with a customer transaction. When Ethan heard that, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said only, "So she lost her job for helping me." And there was something in his voice that his mother would have recognized, a kind of resolve that his father used to get, the resolve of a man who has decided that a wrong is going to be made right. The following morning, Grace was sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee, and the classified ads spread out in front of her, circling anything she might be able to do, when there was a knock at the door. Lily was coloring on the floor by the window. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans, crossed the room, and opened the door, and found herself looking at the young man from the grocery store, only he did not look quite the same. The gray jacket and the worn boots were gone. In their place was a well-cut coat, and beside him stood an elegant older woman with white hair and a kind, searching gaze. "Ma'am," the young man said, "I'm sorry to come to your home like this. My name is Ethan Caldwell. This is my mother, Eleanor." He paused. "I'm the man you bought bread for." Grace's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I remember you," she said carefully. "But I'm afraid I don't understand." "May we come in?" Eleanor asked gently, "just for a moment. We won't take much of your time." Grace stepped back and let them in, suddenly and painfully aware of the smallness of the rooms, the worn couch, the towels stuffed against the drafty window. But if either of her guests noticed, they gave no sign of it. Eleanor simply crouched down to Lily's level, admired the crayon drawing on the floor, and told the little girl she had never seen a finer sun. Lily beamed, and Grace, watching, felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. "Miss Miller," Ethan said, "I understand you were let go from your job because of what happened at the store." "I was suspended," she said, "for helping you." "Yes. That should never have happened," he said, "and I intend to see that it's set right. But that isn't the main reason I came." He drew a breath. "I run a company, Miss Miller, Caldwell Holdings. Maybe you've heard of us." She had, of course. Everyone in the city had. The name was on half the new buildings downtown. "We have a program for developing new leaders inside the company, a trainee program. It's competitive. People with advanced degrees apply for it every year, and most of them don't get in." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like to offer you a place in it." The room went very still. Grace looked from him to his mother and back again, certain she had misheard. "I think there's been some mistake," she said. "I don't have corporate experience. I studied business in college a long time ago, and I never finished the way I meant to. For the past 2 years I've been mopping floors. I'm not the kind of person you put in a program like that." "Skills can be taught, Miss Miller," Ethan said. "A person can be trained to read a spreadsheet, to run a meeting, to manage a budget. Those things aren't hard to learn if you're willing to work. But the thing you showed me at that counter, the instinct to look at a stranger in trouble and give away the last of what you have, that can't be taught. I've spent my whole life around talented people. I've met almost no one who has what you have, and I want it in my company." Grace looked down at her hands. She thought of the rent due at the end of the month. She thought of Lily. She thought of every closed door she had ever stood in front of, and of a mother long gone who used to tell her that kindness always finds its way home. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say yes," Eleanor said softly. "Give yourself the chance the world never got around to giving you." And so, with tears standing in her eyes and her daughter's crayon drawing on the floor between them, Grace Miller said yes. Orientation was the following Monday, on the 22nd floor of a glass tower downtown, in a conference room brighter than any place Grace had ever set foot in. She arrived 30 minutes early in the best clothes she owned, which were nowhere near as fine as the clothes of the young men and women already seated around the long table. She could feel their eyes on her as she took a chair. She could hear the questions in the small silences. "So where'd you come from?" one of them finally asked, a polished young man in an expensive tie. "What firm?" "I didn't come from a firm," Grace said honestly. "I have a degree in business administration, and for the last 2 years I worked as a custodian at a grocery store." The young man's eyebrows lifted. "A custodian," he said. "How did you get into this program?" Before she could answer, the door opened, and Ethan Caldwell walked in. The whole room straightened. He set a folder down on the table, but he did not open it. Instead, he looked around at the faces of the people he had chosen, and he began to speak. "I'm not here to give a welcome speech," he said. "I'm here to answer a question, because I know some of you have been asking it. A few of you have asked it out loud. 1 or 2 of you have taken your questions to human resources." A small ripple of discomfort moved around the table. "So let me answer it plainly. You want to know how Grace Miller got into this program." Grace felt her face grow warm, but she kept her chin level and her eyes forward. "Grace was chosen," Ethan continued, "because she demonstrated something that none of your resumes, none of your grade point averages, and none of your internships can prove. She demonstrated character. A little while ago, she spent the last few dollars she had in the world to buy bread for a stranger. She didn't know who that stranger was. She didn't expect anything in return, and when her employer punished her for that act of kindness, she didn't complain, she didn't threaten, she didn't make a scene. She accepted it, with more dignity than most people can manage on their best day." He let that sit for a moment. "In this company, we don't measure people by their pedigree. We measure them by their choices. And Grace Miller made a choice that told me everything I need to know about the kind of leader she's going to be. If any of you have a problem with her being here, My door is always open. But I'd suggest you spend a little less energy wondering how she earned her place, and a little more earning your own." Then he picked up the folder, wished them all a productive first day, and left. And though not one of those young men and women fully understood it yet, the temperature of the room had changed. Grace Miller was no longer the custodian who did not belong. She was the woman the chief executive had crossed a city to find. Grace worked harder in the months that followed than she had ever worked in her life, and she had worked plenty hard before. She was up before dawn to study the materials she had never been taught, staying late to understand the things the others already knew. She would sit at her kitchen table long after Lily had gone to sleep, a lamp burning low, reading and rereading until the words made sense. There were nights she was so tired she could have wept, and once or twice she did. But every morning she got up and did it again, because she had spent her whole life running twice as fast just to keep pace, and she was not about to stop now. "You're going to wear yourself right down to the bone," Mrs. Alvarez told her one evening, watching her rush out the door with a stack of reports under her arm. "I can't afford not to," Grace said. "Everyone else in that room had a head start on me. The only way I catch up is to work harder than all of them." "Then work," the old woman said. "But remember to breathe, mija. And remember that the girl inside is proud of you. Not for the fancy office, for who you're becoming." And it was true. Something was becoming of Grace Miller. The custodian who used to keep her head down and stay out of the way was learning to raise her hand in a meeting, to ask a question no one else had thought to ask, to trust that the plainest voice in the room was sometimes the wisest. She had a gift the others lacked, and slowly, they began to see it. She listened. She had spent her whole life on the receiving end of decisions made by people who never once asked her what she needed, and she had promised herself, if she ever got the chance, that she would never be that kind of leader. So she asked. She listened. And people, it turned out, will tell you extraordinary things when they can see that you actually want to know. Within half a year, that gift put her name on a very short list. Caldwell Holdings had been chosen to lead a major development on the east side of the city, a whole neighborhood of new housing, a school, a health clinic, and shops, funded in part by a group of overseas investors known as the Kowalski Trust. It was the largest project the company had taken on in a decade, worth an enormous sum, and it was the kind of assignment that made careers. Eleanor Caldwell gathered the senior leadership in the boardroom to announce who would direct it. "I've given this a great deal of thought," she said, standing at the head of the long table. "This project needs more than a manager who can read a blueprint. It needs someone who understands the people this neighborhood is meant to serve. Someone who knows, from the inside, what it means to need a decent school and a clinic you can actually reach. The person I've chosen may surprise some of you. Grace Miller will serve as the project director." For a moment no one spoke. Then, halfway down the table, a man named Victor Shaw rose to his feet. Victor had been with the company for 8 years. He was capable, ambitious, and had spent nearly a decade telling himself that the next promotion was surely his. He had given the firm his late nights and his weekends, and more than one missed family occasion, and he had watched, with a slow and quiet fury, as a woman who 6 months earlier had been mopping floors was handed the assignment he had decided long ago belonged to him. "With respect," Victor said, and his voice was smooth but tight, "Grace has been with the company for half a year. This is a project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Are we certain she's ready for that?" "I'm certain," Eleanor said simply. "Grace has demonstrated exactly the qualities this project requires. A real connection to the community, creative problem-solving, and an honest understanding of the people this development is meant to serve. The decision is made." Victor sat back down, but under the table his hands were closed into fists, and in his mind a small and bitter thought had already begun to take root. "She's making a mistake," he told himself, watching Grace across the room. "And when it all comes apart, I'll be the one standing there to pick up the pieces." Grace threw herself into the project the way she did everything, completely, but she did not begin with blueprints or budgets. She began by going back to the very neighborhood she had grown up in, knocking on doors, sitting at kitchen tables, and asking a question that almost no developer had ever thought to ask. "Most people who come in here," an older resident told her, arms folded, They show up with the plans already drawn. They tell us what they're going to build for us. They never once ask us what we actually need. Then I'm asking, Grace said. What do you need? The answers came pouring out, and she wrote every one of them down. Schools that weren't falling apart. A clinic closer than the 40-minute bus ride to the county hospital. Jobs that paid enough to actually live on. Streetlights that worked. A grocery store within walking distance, so the older folks didn't have to carry bags for a mile. And underneath all of it, the same quiet request, said a dozen different ways. Treat us like people, not like a project. Like partners, not like a problem to be solved. Grace took those pages back to her team, and she reshaped the entire plan around them. Where the original design had called for a certain number of units to maximize the return, she carved out room for the clinic. Where the budget had trimmed the school to save money, she found the savings elsewhere. It was harder work, and it required more of everyone, but the plan that emerged was something the neighborhood could believe in, because for once, the neighborhood had helped to write it. The people who worked with her noticed the difference. That was impressive, a young analyst told her after one meeting. You actually listen to us. Most project leads just want to hear themselves talk. I've had enough bosses in my life who didn't listen, Grace said. I made myself a promise a long time ago that I'd never be one of them. But not everyone was moved by her success. In fact, the better the project went, the more one man's resentment hardened into something worse. Victor Shaw watched Grace's rising star with a sick and jealous heart, and somewhere along the way, he made a choice. The same kind of choice Grace had made at that grocery counter, only pointed in the opposite direction. He decided that if he could not have the project, he would make certain that Grace could not keep it either. The Kowalski Trust had scheduled a formal presentation, the moment when Grace would stand before the overseas partners and lay out the vision for the entire development. It was the most important hour of the project, and everyone knew it. The night before, when the offices were dark and empty, Victor let himself into the shared files, opened the financial section of Grace's presentation, and quietly changed the numbers. Just enough to make the figures fail to add up. Just enough to make the whole plan look sloppy and unsound. Just enough to make Grace Miller look like exactly the unqualified amateur he had always insisted she was. Then he saved the file, shut off the light, and went home to wait for her to fall. The day of the presentation arrived bright and clear. The conference room on the top floor was full, the leadership of Caldwell Holdings on one side, and the representatives of the Kowalski Trust on the other, led by a distinguished older gentleman named Mr. Kowalski himself, who had flown across an ocean to be there. Grace stood at the front of the room, her notes in hand, her heart steady. She had prepared for this for weeks. She knew every number, every promise, every family this plan was meant to help. Good morning, she began, and thank you all for being here. What we're proposing today isn't just a development project. It's a partnership between Caldwell Holdings and the community we intend to serve. She advanced to the next slide, the financial overview, and turned to look at it as she spoke. And there, on the screen, she saw it. The numbers were wrong. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked again, certain she had misread, but she had not. The figures on the screen did not match the figures she had approved. Costs that should have balanced did not balance. Totals that she had checked 100 times had somehow shifted. In the space of a single breath, she understood two things at once: that someone had changed her presentation, and that she now had a choice to make, right there, in front of the most important audience of her life. The easy path was obvious. She could keep talking. She could gloss over it, adjust on the fly, hope no one in the room did the math. Most people would have. Most people, faced with public embarrassment and a career on the line, would have pressed forward and prayed that the errors slipped past unnoticed. Mr. Kowalski himself would tell her later that in 20 years of hearing proposals, that was exactly what he had come to expect. But Grace Miller had built her entire life on one simple thing, and she was not about to spend it now for the sake of one comfortable hour. I need to stop, she said. The room grew still. Mr. Kowalski leaned forward slightly. Miss Miller, is everything all right? No, sir, it isn't, Grace said, her voice clear and even. I owe you an apology. There are errors in these financial projections. These are not the numbers I prepared and approved. I don't yet know how they came to be here, but I do know that they are wrong, and I will not stand in front of you and present figures I know to be false. She set down her notes. I made a promise to this company and to this project that I would operate with complete honesty, and I won't break that promise just because keeping it is inconvenient. She looked around the room, at the partners, and at her own leadership, and, for just a moment, at Victor Shaw, whose face had gone pale. If you'll allow me 48 hours, I'll return with the correct figures. And if those numbers don't satisfy you, then I'll accept full responsibility for that. But I won't ask you to trust a plan built on a lie. For a long moment, no one said anything at all, and then Mr. Kowalski began, slowly, to smile. Miss Miller, he said, in 20 years of evaluating proposals all over the world, I have never once seen a presenter stop their own presentation because of a concern about honesty. Never. Most people in your position would have kept going. They would have hoped we wouldn't notice. They would have finished the show. He shook his head. You couldn't do that. No, sir, she said. I couldn't. I know, he said. And that is precisely why we want to work with you. We didn't fly across an ocean to find a partner with the prettiest slides. We came looking for someone who understands that development is not about buildings. It's about trust. And you, Miss Miller, have just shown us more integrity in 5 minutes than most companies manage to show in 50 years. He glanced at Eleanor, then back to Grace. We don't need 48 hours. We need you. The room, which had been holding its breath, seemed to exhale all at once. Grace stood very still, hardly able to believe it. Thank you, she said, but I still intend to find out what happened to those figures. She did not have to look far. That evening, she found Victor Shaw alone in the empty office, sitting at his desk in the fading light, staring at nothing. He had heard, of course. Everyone had. The plan he had tried to sabotage had not only survived, it had won the partners' hearts precisely because of the flaw he'd planted. His face, when he looked up at her, was the face of a man who had lost something he could not name. Why? Grace asked quietly. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. I never did anything to you, Victor. Why? He was silent for a long moment. Then the words came out of him in a bitter rush. Because I was jealous, he said. 8 years, Grace. 8 years of late nights and missed birthdays and weekends I gave to this company, instead of my own family. And then you walk in from nowhere, with nothing, and you get everything I ever wanted. I didn't take anything from you, she said gently. You took her attention, Victor said. You took the projects that should have been mine. You took my future. No, Grace said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a kind of sad steadiness. You gave it away, the moment you decided to work against me instead of alongside me. The moment you let being jealous matter more to you than being honest. She was quiet for a beat. Then she looked at him more closely, at the hollows under his eyes, at the untouched cold coffee on his desk. You haven't eaten anything today, have you? She said. It was not really a question. Victor stared at her, and his composure cracked. Why are you being kind to me? He asked, his voice rough. After what I did? Because kindness isn't something a person has to earn, Grace said. It's something you choose to give, and because I know what it feels like to be so afraid of losing something that you stop being the person you actually want to be. She stood, and she rested her hand on his shoulder for just a moment. You have real talent, Victor. Everyone knows it. Nobody ever doubted your ability. The only thing that was ever in question was your heart, and that part's still up to you. Then she left him there in the quiet office to sit with himself. She did not report him that night, though she certainly could have. She let him find his own way to the door of accountability, and in time he walked through it, and in time, much to everyone's surprise, including his own, Victor Shaw became a better man for having been forgiven when he least deserved it. But that is a story for another day. The Kowalski development broke ground the following spring, and it was, by every measure, a triumph. But Grace insisted from the very first shovelful that it be measured by the right things. I don't want anyone in this neighborhood to feel like a project, she told her team, again and again. I want them to feel like partners, because that's what they are. The school rose. The clinic opened. Families who had waited years for a decent place to live began, at last, to move in. And within a matter of months, Grace Miller had become one of the most recognized figures in the city. Not because of her title, but because of what she had come to stand for. It was around that time that Ethan Caldwell called her into his office and offered her something new. "Grace," he said, "how would you feel about taking on more responsibility?" "I'm always ready for more," she said, and she meant it. "I want to create a new division," he told her. "Community development and social impact. It would oversee every project we take on, from the very beginning, to make sure that the way we do business stays true to what we say we believe. I want you to lead it. It's a director-level position." Grace felt the old voice stir inside her, the small voice that had followed her all this way, the one that whispered that the custodian could never really belong in a room like this. "I've only been with the company for a year," she said. "And in that year," Ethan replied, "you've done more than most people manage in a decade. This isn't charity, Grace. I'm not offering you a favor. I'm offering you a job you're uniquely qualified to do, because you understand communities in a way no business degree can teach. You've lived the very struggles our projects are meant to address, and you've proven, over and over, that you can turn a good intention into a real result." He smiled. "So, what do you say?" "When I was cleaning floors," she said slowly, "I used to imagine what it would be like to work in an office like this one, to make decisions that mattered, and now that I'm here, I keep waiting for someone to wake me up and tell me it was all a dream." "It's not a dream," Ethan said, "but even if it were, dreams are just practice for the things we're finally ready to do, and you're ready." There was one more thing. A little while after Grace accepted the directorship, Ethan and his mother asked her to come to a quiet lunch, just the three of them, and at the end of it, they set a folder on the table and slid it across to her. Grace opened it, and inside were papers she did not at first understand. A deed, official and stamped, with her name on it. And beneath her name, Lily's. "I don't understand," she said. "It's yours," Eleanor said simply. "Bought and paid for. It's a small house on a quiet street, not far from Lily's school. It isn't grand, it isn't fancy, but it's yours. No landlord, no rent, no fear of losing it. Just a home." Grace's throat closed. "I can't accept this," she managed. "It's too much." "It isn't charity," Ethan said. "It's an investment. A while ago, you invested the last $3 you had in a stranger, when you had every reason to keep them for yourself. Now we're investing in you. And this isn't a reward for the work you've done, or the projects you've finished. This is because of the kind of person you were before any of it. The kind of person who gives away the last of what she has to a stranger. That person deserves a home. She's earned it, though not in any way a paycheck could ever measure." Grace thought of the drafty window and the towels against the sill, of the fear that had lived so long in the back of her mind, of a little girl who deserved a warm room and a door that no one could take away. And for the first time in a very long time, she let herself simply weep, not out of grief, but out of the overwhelming and almost unbearable relief of being seen. That evening, she stood in the doorway of the little house with Lily's hand in hers, and Lily looked up at her and asked if it was really, truly theirs. And Grace knelt down and pulled her daughter close and said, "Yes, baby, it's ours." $3, Grace would say later, when she told the story. $3 bought us a home, and she would shake her head at the impossible math of it, but she knew, even as she said it, that it wasn't really the $3 at all. It was what the $3 had carried. A full year to the day after Grace Miller set down her mop and gave a stranger the last of what she had, Caldwell Holdings held a celebration. Eleanor had insisted on it. She wanted, she said, to mark the anniversary of the day the whole company had been reminded of something it was in danger of forgetting. She had even given the occasion a name that made her son laugh out loud when he first heard it. She called it Bread Day. The ballroom was full that evening, hundreds of people in their finest, and near the end of the program, Eleanor Caldwell rose to speak. "Tonight," she said, "we mark a year of work, of partnership, and of a great deal of hope. But more than any of that, we mark a person, someone who reminded this company, and reminded me, personally, that the true measure of wealth is not what you manage to gather, but what you're willing to give away." She looked out across the room. "Grace Miller, would you come up here, please?" Grace made her way to the front, her hands trembling just a little, and she stood before all those faces, and she spoke from the heart. "A year ago," she began, "I was mopping the floors of a grocery store. I had $3 in my pocket, a daughter at home who was counting on me, and a life that I was, frankly, terrified I couldn't hold together. I was tired. I had been tired for a long time." She paused. "And then, one ordinary evening, a man forgot his wallet, and I had a choice to make. I could keep my $3, which I badly needed, and let him be turned away in front of everyone. Or I could give them away, and simply trust that somehow things would be all right. I chose to give them away, not because I'm a good person, not because I'm anyone special, but because in that particular moment, it was the only thing I could do and still be able to live with myself." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "What I didn't know," she went on, "what I couldn't possibly have known, was that one small choice would lead me here. To this room, to this life, to a family I never expected to find. And I want to be very clear about something tonight, because I think it matters. I'm not standing up here as proof that good deeds are always rewarded. They aren't. Sometimes you do the right thing and it costs you dearly, and no one ever knows, and nothing comes of it at all. I lost my job for what I did, and for a while it looked like that was the whole story." She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm standing here as proof of something better than that. That goodness is its own reward, that the act of helping someone, even when you have next to nothing yourself, is what makes us human in the first place. The house, the job, the title, all of that came later, and I'm grateful for every bit of it. But it was never the point. The point was the loaf of bread." She looked out at all of them. "So here's what I'll leave you with," she said. "Don't wait until you have enough to be kind, because you'll never feel like you have enough. Don't wait until you've made it to be generous, because success was never a requirement for goodness. Give your $3, give your time, give your attention, give whatever it is you actually have, and trust that the world has a way of finding its way back to you. Not always how you expect, not always when you expect, but it does." When she finished, the room rose to its feet. And when the applause had finally quieted, Eleanor Caldwell walked over, carrying a small paper bag, and she handed it to Grace, and she asked, with a knowing look, whether Grace knew what was inside. Grace opened it. It was a loaf of bread. "That loaf cost about $3, Eleanor said gently. "And those $3 changed the course of my son's life, and mine, and yours, and the lives of a whole neighborhood full of people who will never even know your name. I wanted you to have it, so you never forget where all of this began." "I could never forget," Grace said softly, "even if I wanted to." Time went on, the way it does. The new division flourished under Grace's leadership. The Kowalski development filled with families and laughter, and the ordinary noise of a real neighborhood. Lily grew, and Grace watched her grow from the porch of a house that no one could ever take away. And one afternoon, some 5 years after that evening at the grocery counter, Eleanor and Ethan Caldwell asked Grace to come to the top-floor office once more. "Grace," Eleanor said, "we've been talking, the two of us, and we've decided it's time to step back from the day-to-day running of the company. I'll stay on as chairman of the board. Ethan will remain involved, but we need someone to take the helm as chief executive, someone who understands this company not just as a business, but as a mission, and there's only one name either of us could think of." Grace stared at them. "You can't mean me." "We mean exactly you," Ethan said. "Don't say no yet. Just think about it. 5 years ago, you spent the last $3 you had on a stranger. Today, we're asking you to lead one of the largest companies in the country. That isn't an accident, Grace. It never was." "I'm not ready," Grace said. "How could I possibly be ready for that?" "Nobody is ever ready," Eleanor said with the smallest smile. "That's not the question. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you're willing." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm willing, on one condition." "Name it," Ethan said. "That I never, ever have to stop talking to the people who clean these floors." Ethan laughed, and his mother's eyes shone. "That's not a condition, Grace," he said. "That's a promise." And so it happened that Grace Miller, who had once mopped floors for a living and gone home with an empty wallet and a full heart, became the chief executive of Caldwell Holdings. But if you knew her, You would tell me that the title never changed her one bit. She still remembered the names of the people who emptied the trash bins on the executive floor. She still stopped to talk with them, to ask about their children, to learn what they needed. When someone once teased her that she hadn't changed at all, that she still spent her time talking to the cleaning crew, she only smiled and said, "I am the cleaning crew. I just wear nicer clothes now." There is one last part of this story that I want to tell you, because to me, it is the part that matters most. One evening, not long after she became chief executive, Grace walked back through the doors of the very grocery store where it had all begun. Hartwell Market was still there, on the corner of 9th and Vine, a little more worn than she remembered. And there, pushing a mop bucket down the aisle in the fading light, was a young woman in an apron, her shoulders tired, her face carrying that particular weight that Grace knew so well. The young woman looked up, and her eyes went wide with recognition. You're Grace Miller," she said. "Everyone knows who you are, the custodian who became the CEO." "I'm nobody special," Grace said, and she meant it. 5 years ago, I was standing right where you're standing, mopping these same floors, dreaming the same kinds of dreams, wondering if any of them would ever come true. And then one day, somebody saw me, not because I was anyone remarkable, just because I was a person, and I mattered. She reached into her coat and took out a card, and she pressed it into the young woman's hand. "What's your name?" "Rosa," the young woman said. "Rosa," said Grace. "The Caldwell Foundation has a program for people who want to go back to school. Tuition, books, all of it. If you ever want it, if you ever need it, that card is for you." Rosa looked down at the card, and then back up, her eyes bright and disbelieving. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." And Grace Miller smiled the same smile she had smiled at a hungry stranger on an ordinary evening a lifetime ago, and she gave the only answer she had ever needed. "Because someone I didn't know once did it for me," she said. "And she told me that kindness always finds its way back home. I believe her." Then she squeezed Rosa's hand, and she walked out of that grocery store and into the evening, where a little girl who was not so little anymore was waiting for her by the car, holding a loaf of bread she had bought with her own allowance, just because. "How much was it?" Grace asked. $3, Lily said. And Grace laughed, and pulled her close, and looked up at the first stars coming out over the city, and thought about the strange and wonderful arithmetic of a life. $3. It never should have been enough for anything at all. And yet, $3 given away had bought a home, and a future, and a family, and a name that a whole city had come to trust. It had lifted a struggling mother and her daughter out of fear. It had softened a jealous man's heart and given him a second chance. It had built a neighborhood and sent a young woman named Rosa back to school, and it was, even now, still finding its way from one pair of hands to the next, the way that kind of thing always does. Because that is the secret that Grace Miller learned, and the one she spent the rest of her life passing on to anyone who would listen. Kindness is not something you can afford or not afford. It is not a luxury for people who have plenty to spare. It is the simplest and the most powerful thing in the world, available to every single one of us, no matter how little we think we have. You do not need to be wealthy to change a life. You do not need to be important to matter. You only need to be willing, in the ordinary moment, to look at another person and decide that they are worth your last $3.